All right, so welcome to week 2 of Techquitable. Today we'll be covering 3 topics of interview process, resume, and behavior rounds. And in terms of the timeline, we'll be spending about 20 minutes on the interview process, and then 30 minutes each on the resume and the behavior rounds topics. And as a kind of like a short introduction of myself, my name is Wentel, and I'll be leading this presentation today. A little bit of my background, I studied applied math and computer science at Harvard College and graduated in 2017. And since then, I've been mostly working as a software engineer. My current job is to work as a software engineer at this venture capital firm in San Francisco called Signifyer. And before this, I was at a consumer marketplace company called Thumbtack. And was working as a full stack, basically a full stack engineer. So I work on both the back end side of the system and the front end side of the system. All right, so that's a little bit of my background. And let's deep right into the interview process. So this is like kind of like a bird's point of view on an interview roadmap, but we believe that there are like 5 key phases to this. First phase is hopefully where everyone is right now, which is the long-term preparation. This is like kind of like the phase like where you go to colleges, or if you're like coming from a non-traditional background, be going to these like coding boot camps or other preparatory programs. And this is like where you kind of like spend the time to build the technical skills and fundamental knowledge to by taking classes and building projects. And we believe that this is a long-term thing, and it could take anyone from like a year, 4 years to kind of like get ready and just observe like all that they can. And once this is kind of like going or done, then this is like where we kind of step into another gear, which is phase 2, and this is a short-term preparation. This is where people start to kind of review data structures and algorithms. And there are a lot of famous resources, both online and offline out there, such as Cracking the Coding Interview, which is a pretty famous book that talks about kind of the process and also like teaching you about how to solve them, and also a bunch of problem lists to kind of go through. And then in terms of an online resource, there's also kind of like a famous website out there called LeetCode, that kind of gives you like a question bank and allows you to solve them in an interactive way. And lastly, there's also a section where you might want to dedicate to practicing the behavior rounds, and we'll kind of go a little into that later today. But we believe that this phase of preparation takes several months, and it's kind of important to kind of highlight that it's almost like a special case here, because you might think that, well, just because I'm studying computer science or similar related major in college, I'm good to go, right? Well, ideally that would have been a yes, but unfortunately, we believe that a lot of jobs do require kind of specialized preparation that's separate from like your schoolwork or coursework. So that's why we're highlighting it as like a special phase in this like interview roadmap. And as you're kind of like doing this preparation, or as you feel like you're in the like kind of the later phase and you feel ready, then this is like where you have like a job search. And this is, when you think about exploring what companies and role you would like to work in, right? You could get some good ideas by talking to some of the friends, who may have had like a similar roles. If you don't have someone in your circle, it may still be a good idea to just reach out to anyone in your alumni network on LinkedIn. Just like look them up, see where they are, and check if they were working at a company that you may be interested in, and just reach out to them and ask, hey, I'm actually curious about the role that you're working in, and I'll be curious to hear more. That's a good place to start. And a lot of like alumni, seeing that you come from the same school and the same background, would be kind of like eager to help you and set up like this like 30-minute chat either over Zoom, before pandemic, could have been over a coffee, to just kind of like have that meeting with you and kind of like talk you through about what the job is like and what the process is like as well. And then there are also a bunch of tools out there, such as like LinkedIn, Indeed, Handshake, use a website, some of the website that could help you find some of the job openings that are out there. And it's a pretty long process as well. So we think that this is also something that's gonna take several months. And once you go through those like initial 3 phases, the 4th phase is the actual interview. So this is like, this is going to happen once you apply to a bunch of companies, and hopefully some recruiters at the companies will start to reply back to you and, set up a phone calls and arrange further interviews. And this is when you want to kind of like keep good communication with your recruiters, who's going to be kind of like, serving as your river guide throughout the entire process. And then once you have that, you should just focus on passing each round to the best of the abilities that you could. And we think that this is also something that could take anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks for each company. So, just kind of like budget that in terms of like a timeline expectation. And lastly, when everything kind of goes well and your company, the company that you're interviewing with gives you an offer, hopefully you have like this chance to make a decision about whether you want to kind of take the full-time position in this company versus maybe like some other role that you have at other company. And kind of like evaluate whether this, there was like a particular offer that you would like to go with more than the others. And if you're having trouble, then, perhaps, once again, friends or like other people who are already, in the process, or even your mentors, could be a good person to reach out to. So, and usually companies also give like 1 or 2 weeks at least to kind of let you decide. As a college student, you may have like even more leeway. If you have like an early offer that kind of like happens in the fall, they might give you like a month or 2 to like let you decide and see if you want to go with them. So, yep, so this is a high level overview of an interview roadmap. But before I kind of dive deeper into this, 4th phase of interview, I wanted to see if you guys have any questions. If not, that is fine, and we'll just keep this train running. All right, so let's dive deeper into the interview rounds. So, interview. So, you may be wondering, okay, so what actually happens in once you kind of like send your resume away, right? Well, we think that there are kind of like 4 main rounds to interviews. So first is a resume screen. Basically, this is kind of like applicable to like, most other jobs in the world, which is like, first you apply to companies with your resume, and recruiters will usually kind of like, go through them and see, and if there's a good fit, then they will either they will email you back and try to set up a phone call with you. So this is the first round. It's the resume screen. And once you pass that, then it goes on to the second round, which is a recruiter call. This is usually when you have like an initial 30-minute phone call with your recruiters, just to kind of like, share more background about yourself and kind of sharing about like why you applied, and recruiters also tell you what the process will be. Most likely, this is just like the call with the recruiter and not with an actual engineer or not. So there's not going to be a coding. It's more like an initial check to make sure, hey, you are the person that you described in your resume, and you also know what you're signing up for, that kind of thing. So there's that recruiter call round. It's a 30-minute phone call, usually. And once you pass that, then it comes into this more like a challenging rounds, which is the technical rounds. Usually what this is it's often going to be like a 16-minute session with a technical interviewer. And this can be conducted either a phone call or video call with like an online code editor or like a Google Doc. And interviewer would ask you questions around like data structures, algorithms, or even system designs. And it's a very kind of like a challenging process, and you kind of get to see why later. But here, like, you can expect to kind of go through 1 to like 2 remote technical rounds before reaching the final round, which is the on-site interview. which I believe is still remote during COVID. So before COVID, this was like a one-day event in which a company would like fly you out to their site, and you would have like a 3 to 6 interview session with your interviewers. And usually one of them will be like a non-technical interview over lunch, so that you can also kind of like get a better sense of the company. But otherwise, these technical interviews kind of follow the similar format as like the remote technical round, and very kind of like focus on like problem solving. So this is like a pretty grueling process, because you're pretty much like using your brain and trying to like solve this problem like all day long. Yeah, but this is the kind of the final round. And if once this is done, your university will usually get together and discuss like whether they would like to hire you for the role that you are interviewing for. So this is kind of like the 4 interview rounds that happen once you kind of like send resume over to the company. And now let's dive even deeper into what actually happens in each of those technical rounds. So as I mentioned, they're usually 60 minutes long. And in the first 5 to 10 minutes, people usually start with introduction, such things about like, okay, what are you studying? What kind of courses you have taken? And the interviewer could also explain about like, what the title and what they do at the company as well. So once that introduction is done, the majority of that technical round is going to be spent on problem solving, and this could be taking anywhere from 45 to 50 minutes. And this is when you're expected to solve like anywhere from 1 to 2 technical questions with working code, and also expectations for answers for time and space complexity analysis. If you don't know what time and space complexity analysis are, they're also known as like runtime or space requirement. If you still don't know them, that's fine. This is something that we'll cover in our next lesson. So and usually the flow is that your interviewer will go over the problem along with some examples, and then you take a moment to make sure you understand the problem and ask questions to just clarify any aspect that you're not sure about. It's also good to like ask questions so that you narrow down the scope of the problem, and also make sure that you're on the same page with the interviewer. And oftentimes these questions are pretty hard, so you can like take a moment to think about how you will solve them. So you can like, if you're kind of like a quiet thinker like I am, I usually like to stay silent when I think for like the first like for like a minute or so. And once I have and once you have like a high level idea about how you approach it, then this is like where you kind of need to now get into the communicative mode and start sharing your thought process. And then in that thought process that you share, hopefully you can start with like describing the brute force solution, which is some kind of a working solution that could solve this problem. That doesn't like really try to optimize the runtime or space requirement. And later, then once you establish that baseline or brute force approach, then hopefully you can come up with a more optimal approach that has a better runtime, that has a better space requirement, and try to give that to the interviewer. And once you kind of like start discussing and agree upon a solution, that's when you start like writing code. So you see that there's like a lot of communication process that happens in this initial part of the problem solving, and until like you kind of like agree on like a proposed solution, you don't write code at all, right? So it's kind of important to highlight that yes, there is an urge to start writing code right away when you get a problem, because you feel like you're pressured over time, and you feel like you need to start hitting the road like as soon as possible. But it's important to have that communication process, because otherwise most interviewers will be like, oh, whoa, hold on, like let's talk about it first. And that that could also kind of throw you off or make you more nervous, right? And it's also helpful, right, that if you have like a high level idea about how you're going to solve it, then it becomes a matter of like kind of translating that thought into like a working code. So that's kind of like usually how it works. And then once you write your code, then you hopefully you also write a few test cases to make sure that your code works. That could also highlight to the interviewer like how you think about testing the code, or just throwing some being able to like think about some edge cases. So that's like also like a pretty important process. And a lot of times, you are writing this code in like a rush, so there will be some kind of typo that would, or some kind of like a syntax issue that may lead your code to not build properly or fail. So don't panic, because usually the first few rounds of like you clicking on that run might not run the code. So just take a deep breath and fix your code. And once you do all that, your interviewer may ask you, hey, what I think is your runtime or like space requirement over your code is that haven't been established already. So you can answer that toward the end of the problem solving session. And some companies like to do this, but what they do is like they would like to kind of like first like give you like an easy question so that you can kind of do all that. And then later on, like, ask you to follow up, well, if I were to change the problem this way, or if I were to expand the problem in this way, how would you go about it, right? And then now you have to kind of repeat the same process again, but then solve the second problem. So this is also, important to kind of call out here, just because the problem is easy, you may not want to like spend all the time in the world, or that entire 45, 50-minute session slot that you have to solve that. If it's easy, and if you're confident about solving it, you might want to just like move along as quickly as possible, because there might be that second follow-up question. So this is kind of like how what happens usually in the technical round. Just to also kind of like highlight some like potential other paths. That first like few minutes in which like you ask that question and thinking about how to solve it, it's a very, very pressuring environment. And there's not 100% guaranteed that you might come up with this proposed solution in the first pass. And what happens then is that, hopefully you can try to like talk to your interviewers about, whatever you're thinking about it right now and the parts that you're stuck on. And you hopefully can kind of talk through them and try to come up with a solution, kind of propose a solution together. That's not the worst thing in the world. And it's, and that's doing that is totally better than like not coming up with the solution at all and giving up. So just wanted to also call that out as well. And lastly, once that is done, usually the last few minutes is left for Q&A. So this is an opportunity for you to like learn more about the job, and also show that you're kind of excited, especially, that's actually what you're feeling. So, and this is like when you can kind of like ask the interviewer about the role, the company culture, the team, or what the day-to-day look like. So you're just calling out there, and it's also like not the best to also just say, hey, I actually don't have any questions, because that may show that you may not be too interested in the job, or that you haven't done the homework of looking up the company. So use that time wisely as well. So, but I'm gonna take a pause here. Any questions?
Hi, I'm wondering, so before the technical round, is there any kind of interview round in which they ask about your work in the resume, for example, projects that you have worked on or something of the kind?
Yeah, that's a good question. That may happen during the recruiter call, when the recruiter, who's usually like a non-technical person, wants to kind of like make sure that you would have the right background and the skill to even go through the interview process. And that's when they may want to ask you about, hey, yeah, what is the project you have worked on, or like, have you taken the data structure and algorithm class specifically, or they might ask you, hey, do you have any previous internship experiences, right? Your recruiter could be asking you this kind of question. And also, even when in this technical round, the first 5 to 10 minutes is also usually spent on introduction. And this is when your interviewer might be asking you some of the same questions as well. Um, but there are also some interviewers who like to just say, hey, just give you a bare minimum of their introduction and just dive right into the problem solving. So it could vary person to person.
Great, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions?
How much time should you spend describing your approach versus actual code?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let's see. So that kind of like initial kind of like a discussion phase could probably take somewhere from 3 to 7 minutes, right? I think that's the kind of ballpark range that I would give it at. If it's taking any longer, then it really kind of takes away the time from actual code implementation. And so I think that's the ballpark range that I would give it for that discussion. And that 7 minute is kind of like the more like a tail end. But this is like when you might be like actually kind of struggling to come up with a solution in the first pass and want to kind of like have like more discussion or question, like ask the interviewer to kind of clarify things so that you can try to get a clear answer to that problem. Yep, great question so far. Any other one before I move on? All right. So in that case, I'm gonna move on. Oops. All right. So kind of like highlight all these like interview process for you guys. And lastly, I'm gonna also try to kind of like highlight, so what kind of things get discussed when interviewers like get together and talk about whether they would like to hire you or not. And just a disclaimer, by all no means this is like the industry standard or like this is like the universal template, but these are some of like the frequent or more common attributes that may show up in an interview rubric. But interviewers usually look for kind of like candidates like strength in these like 4 themes. And these 4 themes are problem solving or analytical skill. 2 is technical knowledge or coding skills. 3rd is communication or cultural fit. And 4th is experience or ability to learn. And I'm gonna dig into each one of them. But to start with the first one, which is problem solving or analytical skills. This is when your interviewer will be asking themselves, well, did you need much help solving the problem? How often was it? And how long did it take you to like arrive at a solution? So it's very much kind of like the core of like, okay, how good were you at problem solving? Because as a software engineer, you're gonna have a lot of problems to solve every day, so you write code. So this is like something that they will ask themselves and want to have like a good take about how strong of a problem solver you are. And then the second piece is somewhat, it's also like strongly related, which is the technical knowledge or coding skills. And this is like something in which the interviewers were asking themselves, well, were you able to implement a working solution? Was your code clean and organized? Do your code handle edge cases and whatnot? And do you know your solution's time and space complexity? And also, did you think about like trade-off for your solution, right? How this is different from problem solving is that some candidates may be like really good at problem solving and kind of like highlighting the proposed solutions, but they may like struggle at translating that thought into like an actual working code. And as a software engineer, you need to kind of like write a working code and ship products or ship solutions. So they also want to make sure, hey, do we really have the technical chop to kind of like to implement kind of like the solutions or thoughts that you have in your head. And this is like when they kind of like try to see, hey, is your code clean, right? Like, do you name the variables in the right way? Or do you like know how to use the right data structures? And if they're kind of competing ideas, like, are you making the trade-off or are you at least aware of it? things like that, that your interviewer would be like looking for as you kind of implement new solutions. And the third piece is communication. And this is like, in aspect in which your interviewer be asking, did you communicate well with the interviewers? Or how well, or like, how did you handle running into some blockers? And this is also something that interviewers look for because software engineering is like very much of like a team sport. There's a lot of collaboration that's involved. There are also like a lot of questions and answers that needs to happen over the job. So this is something that your interviewer also wants to like get a pretty good signal on. So being like a good communicator is like really important here. You don't want to just be silent all the time and just like write a working code and just call it a day. If anything, I mean, I personally know that I tend to be on the shy side and may not speak as much. But during an interview, I try to kind of like, let's say, correct that by being more on the communicative side, so then I can actually kind of share kind of what's going through my thought process at that moment, right? And if there are any issues, they also wanted to see, hey, were you flustered and just kind of threw up your hands and gave up? Because if that's the case, then you're gonna have a hard time as a software engineer, right? So then they also want to see, hey, can you kind of like handle that pressure and try to like resolve it in like the most like calm or like smooth way as possible. And you'll have, this is like something that where you have to recognize, well, it is fine to run into blockers. When you run into them, just try to one, like think through them and see if you can figure out yourself. If not, just let your interviewer know, hey, this is the area that I'm having trouble with. Would you be able to help me with it, or would you be able to give me some hint? And once you kind of communicate in such a way, your interviewer would not really take that as like too much of a negative thing, and also try to kind of take you to the next next aspect of the problem or next hint that could help you overcome that blocker. So it's important to have that communication piece. And lastly, this is experience or ability to learn, which is something in which like interviewer would ask something like, hey, have you worked on a large project in a team setting? Or have you made good technical decisions in the past? Do you show signs that you can learn things quickly? And lastly, like, do you show drive, initiative, grit, or any other important factors? I will say, as like a really junior candidate, it may be hard to kind of like highlight some of your like past experiences, especially if you didn't have any prior internships. But you can still highlight, if you had some kind of group project at school, and how you worked in a team setting, you can like describe some of the challenges or workflow around that experience. Otherwise, just being able to show that you're a quick learner and you have the determination to do it is also a good sign. So you have some kind of personal stories or like conviction that you're one of those people, then it may be good to like use anecdotes to highlight that about yourself as well. But yep, so these are kind of like the four kind of themes that are common in interview rubrics. But also wanted to show you guys this so that you're aware about like how you're evaluated in these interviews. All right, lastly, so I know this is a lot and you might be thinking, well, how can I best prepare for this? And here's our take, which is we think that there are kind of like 6 main things that you could do. And the number 1 item is to prepare a great resume. And this is so that you can stand out from like this, like, hundreds or thousands of applications that these recruiters may be receiving. And the second thing to do is reviewing data structures and algos. You really want to become comfortable with them so then you can have like a fast recall and also be able to think about the different kind of trade-offs or different like possible approaches to the problem. And then we can do this by like reading your textbooks on this course on that topic, or reading other books such as Cracking the Coding Interview. LeetCode also has like an online tutorial, like interactive tutorial component that you can go through, and that would also really help you learn these kind of concepts. So that's important. The third thing to do is knowing your big O. Big O here is kind of like also, once again, it's like a notation that's used in runtime and in space requirement. So understanding that and also being able to kind of like, say what your solutions, what kind of like big O notations your solution have would be important. And number 4 is, just like many other things in life, like just practice, practice, practice. Like ideally you would have to kind of like practice through different types of questions so that you get to build familiarity and also comfort with various topics. And once you do enough practice, you can also start to see a pattern about, hey, this is a moment when I might want to introduce like a hash map over like an array to kind of like cut down on the runtime, things like that, right? Like insights that you start to build as you practice more and more. And the 5th piece is that you also want to practice sharing thought process. So communication is key, right? As we have mentioned. So you want to make sure that you know how to share your thought process and not just like be able to solve the problem. Like, some of the tips that I have is, as you're thinking about the thought process, you might want to just talk to your computer screen or to your mirror about, the kind of thought process you have, so that you have that kind of like practice in. Personally, I didn't feel really comfortable like doing that. So what I did in the initial part of it was to kind of just write down my thought process, so then I understand how to structure my thought. And once I got comfortable with writing down, then I started just like reciting them, just so that I became like more familiar and comfortable with that. So that's something that I might also recommend to others who might find the process of like just talking to themselves like a little awkward, a little uncomfortable. Then I would just suggest like, just first writing it down as like a practice. That's like an alternative way to get started. And lastly, to kind of like wrap all this up, you may want to find friends or mentors to do mock interviews, so that you can kind of like, practice all these things together. So that wraps up the section on interview process. The next topic will going into the resumes, but right now I would like to just take a pause here and get some questions from you guys, if you guys have any. Any questions?
I actually had a question.
Yep.
So the timeline that you showed for the interview process and preparing was for a job search, right? A full-time job.
Mm-hmm.
What would the timeline look like if it was for internship?
For internship, got it. Yes, well, let's get back to that slide. You were kind of referring to this slide over here, right?
Yeah.
So with regards to internship, I believe a lot of like large tech companies already start to recruit for summer interns already as early as like the fall of the previous year. So what that means is like if you are like sophomore or junior thinking about summer internship in the year of 2022, then a lot of these like recruiting or interview process is happening now. And that could kind of go on until, for most companies, until like the Thanksgiving or even like early December. And then it would usually kind of die down due to the holiday season. And then, I think large tech companies like tend to just wrap it up in the fall. But, I also know that there are some companies, some large companies and also startups that would also kind of continue that recruiting process into spring, right? Or they might just start it up in February, around February time again, and go all the way until like, April to kind of like, get their batch of summer interns. So that's usually the timeline. So yeah, so if you're like, sophomore or junior, or just looking for internship in general, I would just recommend, just like looking around to see what interview process is open currently. Yep. Any questions? Any other questions? If not, all right, we'll move on to the next section, which is resume. So let's talk about why resume are important. So it's because resume screening, evaluates whether candidate skills, experience, and education is suitable for a role. This is more like a first impression that your recruiter is going to have on you. So this is why you want to have like a great resume that stands out and makes that recruiter excited about reaching out to you and setting up that next phone call. And by like, resume that stands out, I don't mean to like make it super colorful and like, just like, visually outstanding, right? It's more about, maybe there's some aspects of that, but it's more about the content and how you kind of like highlight, all the kind of experiences and skills that you have in like a clear manner is what's important here. And we're gonna dive deeper into this topic today. And the common questions that we get from someone who may be preparing a resume for the first time, kind of like, or around like these topics, which is like length versus length, which is how long do I make my resume? The second question might be like content, which is like, what do I write in my resume? Third is style, which is how do I write my experiences and accomplishments to stand out? And lastly, organization, which is how can I organize my resume? So we'll try to answer those questions. So first of all, in terms of length, our recommendation is to keep it to 1 page. And this is because as a junior, less experienced candidate, we think 1 page is all you need. And recruiters also only spend a very like short amount of time in reading your resume. Some numbers that we hear is like somewhere around like 20 to 30 seconds. So you really want to be able to kind of like, highlight all your accomplishments in your profile in that like short 1 page. So this is like why you need to kind of spend time to like write in the concise way and summarize your accomplishments in a very easily digestible format. And in terms of content, please include the following things, which is like name and contact, your education, work experience, and if you don't have any, that's fine. You could still highlight it in the project section. And lastly, also highlight some of the skills and languages. We think that it's also important to like, also have some skills and languages that and this is because some companies do like use this kind of like a scanning software that tries to look for whether the skills that are mentioned on the resume matches with what the job requirement are asking for. So that's why like if you are Java or C++ coder, it might be good to like just have that like mentioned in your resume so that, if some companies are using such an automated way, that software that they're using also can catch that and evaluate that you actually be a suitable candidate. And we'll show you later how that can be organized. And let's talk about the work experience piece a little bit. So in terms of work experience, like this is where you want to kind of prioritize on, including the roles that are relevant to engineering. And I know as like someone who's like really early on in the careers, like there are a lot of jobs like that are like that may not be relevant to like an actual engineering. So one example is that if you have like spent the summer like working in an ice cream shop as like a high school student or like early on in the college years, you could still mention that. You could say, hey, I worked at Mitchell's Ice Cream as some kind of server. You could just mention that I work here during the summer and serve thousands of ice cream scoops to customers. you may think, well, this is not relevant at all to the engineering job, but it'll still be like, okay to kind of highlight it just so that, just to highlight, you do have some experience like working with customers, working in like a team environment. And that itself could be like highlighting, okay, this person already knows, how much of a work it is to like actually work at a job and understand the hardship around it. So, and that's already better than like not highlighting any of that at all, right? But something better might be just prioritizing on highlighting the roles that are more relevant. For example, he worked at a school library, so you could say, hey, I worked at this like Mitchell College Library as an IT technician, and I help students to troubleshoot computers and printer networking issues, or help IT to integrate like new vendors into the school's cloud software suite. Right? I mean, these roles may not actually have have you write any code at all, but at least kind of get you in this domain of like working with this computer systems and like working with like or like onboarding a software. So that could also show that, hey, you're already kind of proficient in this domain. And then the natural next step for you is to actually like start writing code and work as an engineer, right? So that would be like a pretty good work experience to highlight in your resume. Now, if you don't have any of this work experience, that's fine. You could still kind of like highlight it in the project section. And this is like where you want to write about projects to kind of like, present yourself as more experienced, even despite being a junior candidate. So this is section in which you could highlight anywhere from like 2 to 4 most significant project you worked on, and mostly that could be through your schoolwork, or that could be outside of it if you're like doing some kind of extracurricular. And for each project, you want to state what the project was and what language or technology was used to build that. So that way you could also highlight that, well, you already have some experiences under your belt. Oops, sorry, went the wrong way. Next up, skills. Once again, this is like a section where you want to like list your skills to see that you have like some good match with the hard requirement they're looking for. So if you know some like technical software such as Linux, Visual Studio, IntelliJ Xcode, feel free to throw it on there. If you know specific languages or technologies, it would be also nice to like organize in like a table format and just list them. And for those like some languages that in which you have like a different familiarity level, you could also highlight that as well. So if you feel like you are already a Java expert, then you could write that down, but like less so on like C++ and Python. And then you would just write, okay, I'm not an expert, but I'm proficient, or like I have like a basic understanding of these languages, right? And besides the languages, if you are into web development, there are a bunch of stacks that are involved, and you could also highlight some of that. So example, on the front end, you could mention that, hey, I know HTML and CSS, but I know how to work with React. Or on the back end, you could say, hey, I have worked with like Postgres and MySQL database, or use like web development frameworks such as Spring or Flask. And even having those keywords could show to the interviewer that, okay, you have some familiarity with them, and then this is something that you may be comfortable working with or be easy for you to pick up. Obviously, this is like where you don't want to put up like something that that you haven't really touched or like know yourself, right? For example, maybe you have heard about like working with Go before, because that's like some language that's becoming popular in the industry these days, but you have never really like touched it or never really looked into it. In that case, you may not want to put down Go just because like, you have heard about it in the news or anything, right? So yeah, so use your judgment in like thinking about, what languages, what kind of like other skills that you want to highlight. And be prepared that, hey, if you do put them down, your interviewer might ask you about your understanding of those things. All right, now moving on to styles. This is, in resume, basically you really want to write in strong bullet points. So what that means is you want to focus on your accomplishment And you want to kind of follow like this format where you like show what you did, how you did them, and then lastly, say what the results were, right? I think that, in the ideal resume, that's the kind of pattern that it follows. So the format is, hey, I accomplished X by implementing Y, which led to like result Z. Because then that kind of shows you all these three aspects, right? Like showing what you did, how you did it, and what the outcome, of a positive outcome that came out of it. Because even though you're signing up for engineer, most of the time, these organizations, whether they're business or non-business, have some kind of outcome they want to accomplish through these like software. So it's also important to like understand, hey, what are the outcomes they might like, bring in by writing the software, right? So ideally, you would like to kind of like write your resume accomplishment in this kind of format. So just to kind of like use some examples, like an okay way to write it would be like, okay, I built a data exploration tool. But the interviewer like, oh, that's kind of cool, but so what? And how did you do it? Or why did you do it, right? So something better would be like, hey, so I addressed company's data discoverability issue by building a data exploration tool. So that's better because like, okay, this kind of shows you that you actually understood company's like objective in having you write this code. And we will say that the best, way to say, highlight this like accomplishment in your resume, we say something along the line of like, okay, so I addressed company's data discoverability issue by building a data exploration tool that led to 20% reduction in bug reports related to this issue, these issues, right? And now this is like very elaborate, but it's kind of cool because one, you talked about like what you did, how you did it, which is building a data exploration tool. And you're also like highlighting this outcome, which is like leading to like 20% reduction in bug reports, right? So yeah, so this is just an example of like how you could write a strong bullet points. And we'll highly recommend kind of following this type of format. Lastly, in terms of organization, these are some of the tips that we have, which is you want to have like a clearly divided section, consistent spacing. Your resume should also be horizontally aligned. And lastly, you want to use like a good font family and styles. And yeah, so that, if you kind of follow, if you could follow all this, like it shows that you're pretty organized and know how to like present it in like a clear manner. And if you're not sure about how to like do that from scratch, don't worry, we do have some template that you can use here. So we'll send this slide out, but there's a link to this example template that you could use, and kind of looks like this on the side of the screen. But you could like just like use it as a template and fill them out based on your own experiences. Yep, so other resources to highlight, resume template from Techquitable, I just mentioned. Other websites also have like these like free resume builders online that you could like fill out and they will just build a resume for you. So there's one from like Indeed that you could try it out. LinkedIn is also has the beta version that you could also use to build your resume. So yeah, so feel free to use these resources as you're kind of like building your resume for the first time, or as you're like updating your resume to look better. And once again, I'm going to take a pause here, but any questions about resumes?
I have a question. So like regarding personal projects that I do, I don't really know how to quantify the impact because it's just like a personal project. So how would you do about that?
Yeah, in that case, then yeah, unfortunately, you can't really highlight like a like basically quantify like an impact as you mentioned. In that case, you could still like highlight on like how you did it. And only honestly, that's like what mostly personal projects is about, right? Which is like kind of like helping you like get familiar and understand some like technologies better. So you could say that, for example, if you had built like your personal website, using some kind of web development framework, then you could say, hey, I built my personal like blogging site using like, let's say this like web development framework called Django, using Python. And I also kind of use like the Postgres as a backend, and use React on the front end, right? You could highlight these like technologies, so like stacks they use, because it shows you that, okay, like you went through this like full development cycle with these technologies, and you should be already familiar with them, right? So, and then your interviewer would say, oh, wow, that's pretty impressive that you built this thing using these technologies. And it would be really great if those technologies also happen to overlap with the tech that the company is using, right? Because that way the company would also even get like higher confidence that, okay, you already know how to do the job, or you already on a good way to like learn about these things more. So.
Thank you.
Yep, good questions. Any other questions? About resume?
Oh, I have another question.
Yeah.
Yep. So I put my GitHub, like the GitHub link on the resume, and I wonder if recruiters will actually look at your GitHub repos, and should you clean it up beforehand, or something of the kind?
Yeah, so if you are including your GitHub link to your resume, in that case, yeah, you may want to organize a little bit, like make sure something that you want to keep as private is not, set to public, for example, or you may want to like just like rename some of the repos to make it a little clear that what the repo is about, instead of like having a generic name as like a test project or whatever. But I would say I wouldn't spend too much time on cleaning up the code, and also just improving the code, just because like it's not a guarantee that your interviewer will actually spend the time to like check out that repo. And if you had that time, it may be better spent on other aspects of interview preparation, such as like learning how to do problem solving better. So. Yep. But you should just happen to have like some sample project flying around that you want to highlight. It will take more than like, let's say 30 minutes an hour, just cleaning that up. That might be a good thing to do.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? All right. If not, we'll dive into our final section, which is behavioral questions. So the motivation behind behavior questions highlighted here, which is that interviewers want to like kind of ask them to get to know your personality, understand your resume more properly, or just kind of ease into the interview. So what you want to do here is be prepared to answer these questions and give good signals that you'd be a good colleague to work with. I think most companies have policy that even if you are the most brilliant coworker or coder, if you are like a really difficult person to work with, then they would rather just take like, like a good software engineer with like good personality or good collaboration skill, right? So yeah, so some behavior questions is kind of like dedicated to make sure that you be a good teammate to work with. So how do you identify that you ask these questions? So this is a common pattern, which is behavioral questions often start in the following ways, which is, tell me about a time when, like, let's say, you ran into like a blocker in your project, right? Or like, what do you do when, like, let's say your code doesn't compile, and they want to ask you how you go about solving them, right? Or like they may ask, have you ever, let's say, have you ever like, missed a deadline, and what did you do in that case? It's kind of like interesting that the timeline or the deadline issue is such a common issue in industry. Excuse me. And they also want to see how you kind of like respond or react in that case. So I'm going to stop here, but these are some examples in which a behavior question could start. Excuse me. So yeah, these are some example questions, but in which I already kind of like gave you guys some. So there are some strategies that you could do to kind of like answer them in like a more proper way. So step one is to pick the right story, right? So you want to kind of like prepare stories to tell that could highlight your soft skills like teamwork, communication, time management, and resilience. And be prepared for like, you know, what we call the quote unquote negative questions, as the interviewers also want to know how you handle conflict, right? You know, it's probably like given that conflict is part of like working on a team, like there's probably like never like a perfect teamwork. So in those situations, like how do you handle, and like you may usually want to know kind of like your answer to those questions. So yeah, something to do here is like you obviously want to pick like a right story that could like highlight some good aspects about those attributes or skills that you have. And step two is like you want to make a statement. And here you could make a statement that can lead to sharing what you learned from it. And you also don't want to make it about whether you're right, but it's like how you grew from it, right? Because if you were to kind of just focus on, yeah, I was right and my teammates were wrong, it just kind of like shows you that, hey, like you may just like throw your teammates under the bus when things get hard, or or the fact that, okay, you know you may be like a type of person to blame on others when like things happen. So you don't want to really color yourself in such a manner. What you want to do is like, hey, even though you feel like, excuse me, you have like some role in like having that conflict, you could also highlight just how you grew from it. So this is how you could like make a statement. And third step that you could do here is like to finish strong, which is connect the story back to the company or the position and explain how your experience would be useful. And you want to give a short summary. So this is kind of like a 3 high-level steps, and we'll kind of go into examples. So yep. So in terms, so once we have that kind of strategy, these are some techniques that we can actually use. So it's more like a low-level techniques, right? So one really well-known one is like STAR method. So STAR method is a simple framework that can help you tell a meaningful story about a previous work experience. And STAR kind of stands for, it's abbreviation for these like 4 things. S stands for situation, T stands for task, A stands for action, and R stands for result. In terms of situation, this is where you want to kind of set the scene and give the necessary details for your example. So put on the hat of like being a storyteller, and you want to highlight the background and kind of lead up to it. And T is task, which is like, what your responsibility was in that situation. You want to make sure you mention that. And A is action, which is explain exactly what steps you took to address it. And lastly, R is like results, which is share the outcome of the actions you took. So yeah, so let's dive into an example here, which is that the question here is, tell me about a time when you had to coordinate a complex task with your multiple stakeholders. So in terms of situation, you could say, well, in my previous job, I was working on a project and realized that colleagues from other teams are also working on the same part of the code base, as we were all rushing toward like an important feature launch for the customers. So that's the situation. I'm kind of painting you a picture here. T is task, which is, well, I realized that we had to immediately start coordinating and identify which part of the code needs to be reconciled and which parts needs to go in what order. Because otherwise, this will lead into like a merge conflict, and it will also be like a difficult task to like resolve, especially as it gets toward the end part of the project. So what is the action that I did? So I messaged these colleagues as well as like my team's manager to set up a group meeting. And in preparation, I created a proposal document that lists the steps on how we can go about doing that. Right. Okay, now I'm like actually highlighting about, okay, that was, okay, I recognize this situation. I had this task, and this is the action that I specifically took to address it. And then lastly, once you do that, you can talk about the results. Okay, what was the results? Well, at the group meeting, people saw my proposal and came to consensus after sharing more feedback. In the end, we executed based on a plan and got to launch the feature just a few days late. While that was not ideal, but it was certainly better than facing further delays that we'll have to face if we didn't flag this issue until later, right? So I'm not saying, hey, this had a perfect ending, like our launch ended up still being late, but I'm just like kind of like trying to like say, well, but this is still better than being even more late. How do we not like identify this issue early on and took steps to like address it? So this is an example in which like, you know, you could apply like a STAR method to kind of like a highlight and tell a story about your previous experience in a really focused manner. And then we also mentioned that it's important to prepare stories. So one technique that you could use is something called story grid. So this is like something in which like you basically want to kind of think back to your past projects and basically like highlight some of the aspects that fall under certain categories. So for some project, think about, okay, what was the most challenging part about it? And also think about what you learned. What was like most interesting about it? What was the hardest bug that you may have faced? Because some interviewers really like to ask, okay, what is the hardest bug you faced and how you solved it? Just to kind of like understand your problem solving or troubleshooting skill, or what you enjoyed the most about it. And lastly, if you had like any conflict with your teammates, so you kind of coordinated schedules or coordinated like how you split responsibilities, right? So you want to kind of like, you could also prepare these stories and highlight each aspect of that project. And so that, yeah, so if you do that, you have like some stories that you have prepared that you could tell in a ability format. And moving on to other common questions, you could also be asked things like, hey, what are your weaknesses? What was the most challenging part of that project? Or do you have any questions for me? And we'll also kind of dive into how you could answer these questions in a positive way. So in terms of like question about what are your weaknesses, you want to give a genuine answer, right? So a genuine answer shows that you have self-awareness and can be capable of making up for it. So the okay answer would be to say, hey, I work too hard, you know. Hopefully, you know, everybody knows like to put in the work when it's necessary. But that, you know, but at a work, like you might be expected to just work hard, right? And that might be an expectation for everyone. So that doesn't really highlight about your weakness or like your self-awareness even. So you could like say something like, hey, like, so this is just an example, but you could say something like, hey, I'm an optimistic person. And while that gives me confidence in taking on challenges, sometimes that can get in the way of like estimating a realistic project timeline. Because of that, I tend to remind myself that tendency when estimating a timeline, and sometimes to ask my colleagues to check my assumption. We believe that this is a better answer just because like one, it shows you that you know you're like an actual weakness, and two, you could, and this answer also kind of like this highlights that how you make up for it, right? In this example, this person, well, to be frankly honest, this is actually like my personal weakness. And I wrote this down, bullet point myself, but in this case, I tend to like, you know, recheck my assumption myself and even ask my colleagues, hey, does this timeline look right to you? And try to kind of arrive at a correct, kind of like more accurate timeline. So yeah, so this is one way in which you can highlight your weaknesses in a genuine manner, but to also highlight how you're self-aware of them, and what you did to kind of correct them. Next common question is, what was the most challenging part of that project? Here you want to give concrete and detailed answers. So you want to do that because that shows you that you are deeply involved in that project and you can reflect on daily challenges that you faced. Like an okay answer here would be, I had to learn a lot of new languages and technologies. Well, that's fine, but it doesn't really show you how, you contributed to the project or what you really learned from it, right? So like a better answer would be to be concrete and detailed, and this is like a long sentence, but I'm going to just read it out aloud to you guys just as an example, which is, the biggest challenge was fixing this bug that kept failing the app to fetch new object from the API. We investigated code several times, but couldn't seem to find the root cause. So we started to test various theories, and in the end, the root cause turned out to be the app's caching policy that made the app always use cached data instead of new data from the API. We didn't notice it because it was the first time using the new API framework, and the configuration of this caching policy was not in the official documentation. And once again, this is actually coming from my personal experience, which is there was this bug that was really hard to debug, and we didn't really know how to do it because it was not in like official documentation, and it was like our team's first time working with this API. So what we did was like, we kind of put on this like scientist hat and started to like basically set up the various hypotheses. And as we kind of went through each hypothesis and like showed that, okay, that was not the case, then we kind of crossed and eliminated them and just kept it going down the list. So that shows you that, okay, well, this person actually really knew what the issue was. And it also shows you like how that person went about like solving that problem, right? So, yeah, so that would also be a good answer in that, it highlights all those things and gives the interviewer more confidence that you can get your hands dirty in an actual project. And lastly, your interviewers may ask you, what questions do you have for me? Here, this is like a chance for you to ask a good question. The quality of question can also serve as a signal for an interviewer about how interested you are in the job. So yeah, so this could be pretty broad, but there are kind of like 3 question categories that you could think about. The first one is genuine questions. And the purpose of the genuine question is that you could ask to understand more about day-to-day life about that role. So some example here could include asking the interviewers about how much of your day do you spend in coding? Do you spend coding, right? Oh, what does the team composition look like? Like how many people in it? Like whether there are like other non-eng people involved. And you could also ask, hey, what are the good and bad parts of this work? And you may want to know because as you seriously consider for this role, you kind of want to have your both eyes open and and see if you could like just as I said, both the good and the bad part of it. So that's the genuine questions. The second category is like what's called insightful question. This is interesting because you ask to also kind of demonstrate your deep domain knowledge. So you could ask something like, hey, I noticed that you use technology X, so how do you handle problem Y? So just to kind of throw in one example, like let's say a company uses Python, but Python is known to have like a global interval lock or GIL, which basically like allows the Python to work only in a single thread. So that could obviously be a problem when Python needs to kind of scale to like serve like multiple requests or like from like hundreds and thousands of users. So it's like, how do you handle that, right? Obviously, they're like web framework or server like technology that allows to Python to like to work in like an asynchronous way. But you could kind of ask that question to kind of also just demonstrate that you already know a little bit about that and curious like how that company is like applying certain technologies or techniques to solve that issue. So that's what's known as like a insightful questions. And lastly, third type of question is passion question, right? This is something that you want to ask to like demonstrate that you have a passion. So you could say, hey, I'm very interested in scalability. And you could ask that person, did you come in with that background? Or, you know, what opportunities were there at the company to learn about it? Or you could say, hey, I'm not familiar with technology X, but it sounds like a very interesting thing. Like, can you tell me about how it works? That might be something good to ask. Like, let's say if the company you're applying for is interesting, like interesting technology you haven't heard about before, or that you would like to learn more. So yeah, be aware that, you know, these are kind of like 3 type of question categories that you could try to like prepare your questions in. So yeah, be prepared to answer or, you know, use that opportunity toward the end of your interview as well. So that wraps up the lesson for today. And I would like to once again take a final pause here for any Q&A about any of the things that we talked about today.
On your resume, how much bullets did you have to discuss a prior experience?
Yep, that's a good question. Let's go back to that resume slide. So in terms of prior experience, like they're kind of like different levels that you could be talking about. Like one level is like just like highlighting how many experience and highlight. If you want, you could like highlight, you know, all the relevant experience that you have, and that could probably like run anywhere from like 1 to like, you know, 4 or 5. Any more than 5, I would think I would start to like really evaluate well whether like putting that extra role is going to like help you stand out or just going to add more noise to it. So, you know, I would start to kind of like, you know, evaluate more carefully. I'll say probably like 1 and 4 is like a good range. And then for each of those like experience that you highlight, you probably also want to have anywhere from like 1 to 3 bullet points highlighting what that job was about and what you kind of like did in that role. So that would be kind of like the yeah, I guess like our recommendation for that.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions about the interview process, resume, behavioral questions?
I have a question going back to the resumes.
Yep.
I wanted to ask, because, you know, like for experience, you typically list internships, but, you know, sometimes people do maybe like fellowships or programs where they work on a project with their students. How do companies think of experiences such as that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's still a good experience to highlight. And because it kind of shows you that you're involved with this kind of technical community and you also have like a desire to give back or to contribute. And that's generally like a positive thing to highlight about yourself.
Okay, got it. I just wanted to make sure, like, if maybe you're supposed to list that under experiences, or because sometimes people will have like on the bottom or wherever they put it on the resume, like achievements or like things that they did. So I wasn't
I see.
sure to highlight that on the bottom or explain it. So I'm glad that we're able to explain that.
Yeah, yeah. In terms of where to put it, you know, I think that depends to you. For example, you already have like, you know, several internship experiences, then you could dedicate the experience section just to kind of talk about those kind of like paid roles or paid internship roles that you had, and then separate out your like extracurricular or volunteer like experiences in like a separate section, like, you know, that you could call it as like, you know, extracurricular. You know, things, you know, something along that line. Or if you feel like, hey, you don't really have experience like in like an actual job, but you know, you do have plenty of those like extracurricular and volunteer opportunities, then you could, yeah, just like put that under the main experience section as well. So yeah, it really kind of like yeah, I guess like, you know, leaves that decision up to you about how you want to like organize them.
Oh,
But
got it.
yeah,
Oh.
it's a good thing to highlight regardless.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions?
I have a question regarding spreading CVs, spreading the resume. So you mentioned that we can apply through like LinkedIn or Indeed, and we can get referrals as well. But what do you consider to be a good ratio between asking for referrals and getting and just spreading resumes on job sites?
So, okay, so kind of to clarify question, your question was, what is the good ratio between, you said getting referrals?
Yes, because like you said, if I get referrals, then I would need to go onto LinkedIn and maybe message people and ask for a call or something of the kind. So that would take quite a while compared to just like send the resume to the job portal of that company.
I see. I see. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm sure like, people would have different answers to this, but, based on my personal understanding, it's really hard to kind of like stand out when you're applying cold, which means like just directly applying to the company through like their like company portal and just sending a resume. So that's why it's much. I would say you would have a much better chance if there's like someone in the company already that could make that referral for you, because usually that referral application would have like its own like screening like route or screening process, will basically indicate that this person is referred. So that could also serve as like extra signal for that recruiter. By no means like it's a guarantee that you actually get an interview, but it is actually still like a very helpful thing to have. So and you're right, like it does take time to like ask for that referral, whether from someone that or whether someone that you need to like build a relationship from scratch with, right? So my recommendation for this is, if it's easy to ask for referral, and that's like something you're comfortable doing, I think you should definitely go for it. And and this means like if there are like any friends that are like graduated a few years early from you that are working at a company that you like to work for, like that's past like a more like straightforward ask. Otherwise, like let's say that you really want to work for a company but you don't know anyone there, but perhaps like you see like alumni or maybe like some like actual stranger that you feel comfortable reaching out to, and in that case, what you may want to do is you may want to like not directly ask them for referral, but just like just try to ask them if they can have like a 15 minutes or 30-minute conversation with you, so that you can learn more about their role. And as you learn more about the role and you feel like, yes, this is indeed what I'm interested in, then at the end of the conversation, you can ask them, hey, would you be comfortable referring me? And some people might say, yeah, like, I'm happy for you to do that. Or some other people are like, oh, actually, just because I just got to know you, I don't feel comfortable doing that. And that's okay, right? But you could like make that like investment of like 15 to 30 minutes to build that relationship. Because referrals like could also really help you. And in the worst case, well, you could still like learn more about that job, and that's hopefully informative for you, right? So kind of like, to kind of wrap up, long story short, it's definitely better to have like a referral if you can get it. And if not, then applying as like a cold application is the only option you got. But yeah, I think that would be my kind of like my personal take on it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, great question so far. Any other ones that you guys would like to have answered?
Also, when I'm trying to apply for internships or a new grad role, how do you think about reaching out to recruiters that way, referral or not? I would say, I guess, with no referral for this case, but just saying that you're interested in this certain role, but you're just reaching out to the recruiter. How would you go about that?
So to clarify your question, you're asking whether it would be okay to just reach out directly to the recruiter?
Yeah, and then your opinion on it.
Yeah, I will say that I think it's definitely okay, or even like good to like just reach out to recruiters. Just because like, your recruiters are really in the job of like finding good people to draw to their company, right? And the fact that you're like already reaching out in the first place to learn more about it is giving them an extra signal that, okay, you already have inclination or interest in a company. And that would also make things easier for them, right? So, I mean, there could be possible things that could happen. Interviewer might be so busy that they might just ignore you, and that's fine. Like, it's not on you, right? And you just move on and try to like, still continue to apply without referral or just like look for other companies. But that's like one possible path that could happen. Another thing is like, yeah, your interviewer might say, hey, like, I'm really thankful that you're reaching out to me and I'm happy to like explain this job to you. It might actually like set up a call with you, right, to explain. Or they might say, hey, yeah, thanks for reaching out. I'm a little busy, so I can't really do this phone call, but I'll make sure to kind of like forward this like your resume to the referral pile or something, right? So various things could happen, but yeah, I don't think it should be shunned at all. Or if anything, could be good to like reach out to the recruiters directly.
Okay, that makes sense. I was just wondering, like, in the case that you don't have a referral, so that you can just reach out to a recruiter directly. So I'm glad that's okay. Because I wasn't sure if that was just some people do that and some people don't. So I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions before we wrap up for today? Okay, if not, I'll wrap it up here. Thank you guys so much for joining us for the second week of Techquitable. Hope you guys enjoyed and learned something from this lesson. We'll follow up with the link to the slide and the recorded lecture on Slack and email. And feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. But hopefully, yeah, by the end of next week, you should have your first like session with your mentors already. So make sure that you're on the path to have that. And if you're having issue with setting that up, please email us at info@techquitable.io and let us know that you're having that issue, and we'll help you get that set up. So, all right, thank you guys so much, and I hope you guys have a nice rest of the weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. You as well.